So far, you've been working with views that don't really do anything. They aren't interactive. They don't affect anything else and nothing affects them. Let's try out something a little more complicated, like using a color picker to update the color of an image. In the starter project for this episode, you'll find a bit of UI already set up for you. Nothing you couldn't put together yourself at this point. Let's create an interface to change the background color for this Swift. Open up the library. Try the keyboard shortcut Shift-Command-L. Search for the color picker in the Views tab and drag one to the top of the VStack. Change the title to Swifty Color. Now take a look at this second argument. In fact, Option-click on Selection. The type of selection is a binding to a color. Out of the box, you've got a constant.red to fill that in. That will get your project compiling right away, and a constant binding can be super handy for previewing views, which you'll see later. But it's not going to help you change the color of our Swift bird. You need to store the selection of this color picker somewhere and then pass that selection onto your image. So step 1, add a new property to Content View. But this won't be just a regular property. It needs to be a state property. If you try to just pass that into the color picker, it's not going to work because you need a binding to a color and not a color. But this error will suggest the way to fix it, which is just to add a $sign. Great. Now you can pass just regular Swifty color into the background for the image. Aha, we're in business. And you can test this out to make sure that when you use the color picker, the Swift's background changes. You can do this without running the app via live previews. With the canvas in play mode, the preview should be automatically updating. If it doesn't, you can click the refresh button to get things rendering. Click the color picker, switch the color, and hey, that's working too. Which is great, but you might wonder why you need it to do all that state and binding business. In SwiftUI, views are functions of their state, and data is a first-class citizen. When the data driving a view changes, that view has to be re-rendered to reflect the change. But views are structs, value types. The views aren't mutating when things change. SwiftUI is returning new views each time. So you need a way to set aside a view state as a mutable type in memory that, when triggered, will re-render the view. This is where the @state attribute comes in. When you add the @state attribute to a view property, that property is automatically set aside in memory as a mutable type that has an actual binding to the view itself. This symbol indicates you're using a property wrapper. That's another of those special Swift features that was introduced along with SwiftUI. It adds functionality to a property. In this case, @state is a property wrapper that updates your UI whenever the value of the property bound to it changes. You'll see a lot more property wrappers as you go through this course. They're essential for controlling data flow in SwiftUI. The second half of this bit of SwiftUI magic is bindings. Normally, when you pass a value into an initializer for a view, you're literally passing in a copy of the model as a dependency, like how you passed Swifty color right into that background modifier. But you saw that the color picker takes a binding to a color in its initializer. With bindings, you're passing in some way to connect directly to some data rather than the data itself. That binding automatically updates the state whenever its value is set or changed. When you mark a property with state, it gives you access to a bindable value. To pass a binding along rather than just a value, you just need to add the $sign in front. Back in our project, let's try another state binding combo. First, add a state variable for opacity. And then to use it, add a slider just below the color picker. Pass in a binding to Swifty opacity with a $sign and set the range to between 0 and 1. For the heck of it, let's also change the accent color to match the current Swifty color. In that case, you can just pass in the data as usual. The slider won't be changing Swifty color at all. Now down in the image's opacity modifier, pass in the new value. Are you getting the hang of this? I'll let you go for a challenge in a minute, but first, let's try something else. One of the strengths of SwiftUI is how composable it is. It's really easy to create little views and add them together. It's also easy to pull part of a view out into its own type. In fact, Option-Command-Click on Color Picker and try selecting Extract Subview. Name the extracted view Swifty Controls. Embed the color picker in its own VStack and cut and paste the slider right below the color picker. You've got some errors now because this new Swifty Control struct doesn't have access to these properties anymore. To pass those along, copy and paste the state variables from above into the Swifty Control struct. The problem now is that you don't actually want these values to be tied to Swifty controls, and this @state is saying this is the source of truth for this data. Both of these values should really live in content view. So how do you get the bindings we need into this struct? Well, just like we're passing bindings into the slider and the color picker, we can say we want to pass bindings into Swifty controls. For that, use the @binding property wrapper and delete the initial values. For good measure, to reinforce where those state variables belong, mark them as private. And then let the error help you fill in the dependencies for that instance of Swifty controls. Give the whole thing one more try with a live preview. Now you're ready for a challenge.